Hello, my name is Mehran. I'm putting up a video regarding the current US-Iran relations, and in particular the nuclear talks that have been taking place, and the Middle East situation, especially in connection with what's happening to Russia and the Ukraine, because I do believe that all these events are very much linked. Now, first question. What is the root cause of the rapprochement between the US and Iran? According to some newspaper reports, the new president, Mr. Rouhani, has been convincing the supreme leader, Mr. Ayatollah Khamenei, that it is in Iran's best interest to make a deal because the economy is doing extremely badly and there is a lot of discontent inside Iran. And in order to prevent the discontent from spreading and causing mayhem, they need to reach a deal, and apparently the supreme leader has agreed. Now, on the American side, why is it in their interest? Well, it may surprise you to know a lot of it has got to do with what's happening on the ground inside Iraq. Now, as you know, the Iraqi army had suffered a number of defeats recently, including the loss of Mosul. Now, the power that's holding the Iraqi government and the Iraqi army together, believe it or not, is not the US, but it's actually Iran. So with the help of the Iranians, they've now taken back the city of Tikrit. And the Americans realized that. And in fact, the Americans were doing the airstrikes in order to help the Iraqi army, backed up by Iran, to take Tikrit. Now, imagine a scenario in which, without the help of Iran, the Iraqi army and the Baghdad government completely collapses, as was nearly the case about a year ago when ISIS were on the outskirts of Baghdad. If ISIS had taken Baghdad, which was quite possible, it was within their means, because after all they did take Mosul, which was the third city. If they had done that, then America's reputation around the world would have been utterly crushed, because America spent $3 trillion propping up the Iraqi government and the Iraqi army, and they were there since 2003. So that is 12 years. Imagine after 12 years of supporting that government, it collapsed overnight, and then Iraq was descending into mayhem. What would the rest of the world think about American power? American threats to invade, Americans' power, American threats to reshape the world in their own image. You see, this would have been an utterly crushing blow. Therefore, Americans, I believe, have had a rethink. And they think that actually, perhaps, they do have a lot in common with the Iranian government. Because across the border in Afghanistan, would you believe it, the Afghan government's best friend is also the Iranian government, not the US government. And Iran is helping prop up the two governments of Afghanistan and Iraq that the US has spent $3 to $5 trillion in creating, and two failed wars. Therefore, all credibility they have across the world will be utterly vaporized if these two governments, without the help of Iran, were to fall. And that, I believe, is the root cause of the rapprochement on the American side, despite Israel's best efforts. Um, and on the Iranian side, they're now saying that it's in their best interest for the sake of the economy. So, um, this is very, very interesting because it does seem that on many issues, the US and Iran's um, interests in the Middle East are coinciding. Both countries want to prop up the Iraqi and Afghanistani government. Both countries want to curtail Wahhabis and extremism in some forms. So they do have a lot in common, and there may be some people in Washington that may be rethinking their relationship with Israel, especially after Mr. Netanyahu came to Washington without being invited by Mr. Obama and gave a speech in the Congress and the Senate. So, this rethink in American-Israeli relationship may be causing a little bit of coolness between the two countries. Um, so, they say history goes round in circles, in whatever you want to call it. So I'm sure behind the scenes there's a lot of dealings going on, and after the removal of sanctions, I think the Europeans want to get in and do a lot of business with Iran. So, what are the consequences of this new rapprochement in terms of Syria, in terms of Russia and Ukraine? Now, Syria, Iran and Russia are extremely close allies. Therefore, a new friendship, if you want to call it that, with Iran could even mean a thawing of relations with Russia. As you see, these events are not isolated and they're all completely connected. So events in Ukraine, events in Iran, in Syria, in Iraq, they're all interconnected globally. So, what can we expect to see? Militarily, it is quite blatantly obvious that the Ukrainian government has got absolutely no chance if it were to enter conflict against Russia. The rebels themselves have inflicted a large number of casualties against the Ukrainian government. There is some tension in terms of what the elements of the European Union want, what elements of the American administration want, and I do believe there are competing interests going on. Politically, some people are waking up in America and seeing that actually the war in Ukraine is not in America's best interest, and the sanctions they have inflicted on Russia are beginning to backfire. Now, why do I say that? The reason being that Russia has imposed sanctions of her own against the US and against the European Union. And in fact, it's hurting the countries within the European Union a lot more than it's hurting Americans. But the second reason, even much more interesting and much more significant, is that by doing what they have done to Russia, Russia is now beginning to dump the dollar as the world's premier reserve currency. So they've done last year they did a $400 billion deal with China, and China also is tempted to dump the dollar, and many countries around the world are following the same. Now, this dumping of the dollar is far more dangerous in the long run for US imperialism than various military conflicts around the world. Because without the dollar being the world's reserve currency, the entire American economy would be in jeopardy. The thing that is keeping the American economy intact despite the vast, vast debt, which is approaching $40 trillion, is the whole concept of the petrodollar. The petrodollar, which means the link between the US dollar and oil, and the fact that most transactions around the world are done in dollars, means that the US dollar is being kept artificially afloat, without which the entire US economy would collapse. Now, dumping of the US dollars is far, far more dangerous to the American empire than any military defeat or victory. Therefore, from that perspective, once the policymakers in America truly wake up to the extent of the threat of various countries around the world dumping the dollar, then that would be the beginning of the end for the American empire. So that's one big reason. Secondly, as mentioned before, the Americans cannot allow the collapse of the Baghdad government, because psychologically that would be a massive, massive blow to them. As big as Vietnam. Imagine 13 years of occupation, $3 to $5 trillion spent, and they could not affect the outcome of a small country like Iraq. And what would happen? Other countries would follow suit. Every time a threat is being made by America, economically, politically, or militarily, they would just ignore it. Because when one country gets away with standing up to America, then other countries would follow suit. Look at Central America during the 1980s. Why was Nicaragua or El Salvador, with a tiny, tiny, tiny strip of land and a tiny population of 3-4 million at most, a threat to the United States? They weren't a threat militarily, they weren't a threat economically. The reason they were a threat is setting an example to the rest of the world that they can stand up to America. Why was Cuba so annoying for the US? A country of 9 million, a small island, with an economy that barely even registers. Why was it so important to the US? Because it set an example for the rest of the world to stand up to American bullying and American imperialism. And in fact, Fidel Castro did act as a massive inspiration for leaders all around the world, from Colonel Nasser to various leaders in Africa, various leaders in South America, Hugo Chavez, so many Morales, so many leaders took him as an example, as an inspiration to stand up against American imperialism and free their country from American corporation and exploitation. Anyway, I'm bringing this talk to an end. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope that I have touched on various elements in my talk that you would not necessarily get from the media, and hope to speak to you soon. Thank you very much.